So, welcome everyone to the Enlight Life podcast. I'm your host, Alexandra Cousins, and I'm super delighted to be here with Dr. Josh. And his list of accolades is quite vast. And today I'm going to let Dr. Josh introduce himself because, I think you're going to do a better job than I do. So maybe let's start there. Dr. Josh, welcome.
Thanks, Alex. It's great to be here and have this conversation. My background, I have 2 degrees from Harvard, 2 degrees in biochemistry. I was when I was a teenager, I was one of those nerds who enjoyed. Some people enjoyed foreign languages. I enjoyed biochemistry, so I started off in emergency medicine of all things and got board certified in emergency medicine, practiced for a couple decades around 14 states in the United States. And then about a dozen years ago, had my own health issues. I was 50 pounds overweight, had high blood pressure, and me being a smart doctor from Harvard, I couldn't figure out how to fix it. I started myself on 4 different blood pressure pills, and I was like, this is ludicrous. And that's how I actually found alternative or complementary or integrative medicine, was for my own personal selfish. I was trying to fix myself. And then once I was able to do that using plants and other modalities, I want to share this with as many people as possible. I, I, I used to be, and I'm currently at Hippocrates, which is a raw vegan retreat in West Palm Beach, Florida. I was at True North, the fasting center in Northern California, for a few years, and worked in a Lyme mold dementia clinic in Tampa, Florida, it was about 6 years. And I'm currently focused on reversing Alzheimer's. So, yeah, I've done so many different things, and it's really exciting to be with you because your story is also it sounds like you're like me. You're a sponge, and you're trying to collect as many good technologies in order to help your clients get better.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Well, I love your story. I love your background. And so when you reached out to me, I said, well, let's have a real conversation, right? And this is really what this podcast is about. I'm not here to kind of polarize in any particular direction, but I'm really here to offer wisdom around health issues because it is so desperately lacking. And so just before we hit record, which every single time I say the same thing, I wish we would have hit record before and I should learn my lesson and I still haven't every time, because we were saying how, really what's missing in today's world is, I can only summarize it with wisdom, because everyone is polarizing in one direction. So whether it's everyone should be plant-based forever and ever with no other intervention, or, and then within plant-based, it could be raw food, it could be fruitarian, and there's a whole bunch of iterations there and a lot of conflicting messages, right? Where if you're not getting it right, well, you're not part of the clan. And then there's the other group that polarizes towards, more carnivore or paleo. And I mean, there's a gazillion ways, then there's starch based, there's this, is that, the other. And that's just nutrition. And then there's the healing modalities, anything from the holistic to the traditional methods, Ayurveda and TCM and so forth. And then there's the biohackers. And it's like, why? Where do we go with all of this? And the conversation that I want to have is really that there is truth, wisdom, and benefit in all the segments, in everything that is available to us. But the key is, how do we use it?
100%. And how do you coordinate and integrate? And I've got to say, one of the ways you learn this is actually doing it. And many of the clinics I worked at, we would see patients who had been to 10, 20, 30, 40 other clinics and had basically tried everything and said, Dr. Josh, you're our last hope. If you can't fix us, we're giving up. And so
Yes.
obviously it's very stressful. It puts a lot of stress on you, but I'm sympathetic because these people are extremely frustrated. And as you mentioned, there's nothing wrong with being a specialist and doing one thing really well. The problem and the issue is when you're dealing with someone who has a dozen or 3 dozen root causes, you can't just only try one thing and then assume that that one thing is going to fix everything. I wish it would, but most of the time that doesn't work.
I so agree with you. And yes, again, as you said, that was my experience as well. And that's where 10 years ago, after really 40 years of not enjoying living in a body and wondering, what the heck am I doing in a body? Because it doesn't feel very good and nobody can seem to help me with the long list of issues. And it's not just the issues and it's not just the not feeling well. It's going, I've spent so much
Right.
money and time and energy. I felt like I wasn't really fully living because I was always chasing, well, the healing, right? So that then I could live. And this is the story of, I would say, 98% of my clients as well, who have tried everything. And I often, so my question is, how, because as you said, like, I really feel for these people. It's the time, it's the energy, it's the money. A lot of people, they actually come to me after having spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I look at the protocols, and oftentimes these are well-known doctors, and I look at the protocols that were applied, and I just go, I mean, I'm not a doctor, I'm not supposed to know a lot, but does it really take a rocket scientist or a doctor to look at those kind of protocols and go, that would have never worked?
Yeah, 100%. Like, for example, I would see a patient who had been to the world's experts on POTS. This syndrome where
Yeah.
people get weak and dizzy when they stand up, and their blood pressure goes to orthostatic hypotension. And I would see the workup that they got, and it wasn't complete, but they're being touted as the expert on this, and and frankly, they're not. And that was really disturbing.
Absolutely. And I see the same thing happening in mold.
Yep.
In the mold, it's an industry. It is
Yeah.
an industry. Let's face it. And over and over, I am gobsmacked at what is happening out there. And I mean, I'm very outspoken also because I'm not a doctor. So I kind of go, you know what? I say what I want because I'm tired of the BS and I'm tired of seeing people suffering so much, because I really feel, and this is like a foundational belief of mine, we should all have health, right? Like wealth, well, we can all acquire that. But health should be kind of like, I mean, it is supposed to be a God given human right to at least enjoy your life of living in a body. So maybe we can kind of like, for a second brainstorm, how, what do we want to say to these people that are trying so desperately to heal, and yet they're not seeing the results? But then oftentimes they get to the point where really they feel like, oh, well, maybe it's just me. Maybe I just can't heal, right? Like maybe it's all about me. It's not because I haven't seen the right people.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is do not give up hope. Number one. And number two, I see this frequently where people, there's they basically will blame themselves or say the world isn't fair, and get frustrated with the current systems, or if they've been to 1 or 10 different experts and they're not getting better. Just take a step back. It's frustrating, but understand that it is solvable. You just have to go either deeper or wider, and probably both. And the fact that you're listening to this recording means that you are open to it. And frankly, I think that's what both of us bring to the table, is we have a depth and breadth that the typical person who may have only been through one single training program doesn't know and doesn't understand.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that kind of brings me to the topic that I personally, I'm at the point where I don't see the point of being a specialist. Like I just do not.
Right.
because I mean, of course, you can become a specialist if you have gone into the breadth of things, right? Like if you have an understanding of how really the body holistically works, and and as we're talking, I'm gaining an appreciation for who you are, because I can feel that you have this broad spectrum. And I would say that's the most important thing that any practitioner, doctor, specialist could and should learn, right? Because if that's not there, if you are coming as most people, but that's, we can say the raw foodist, we can say, someone in traditional Chinese medicine, anyone who believes that their one system or their one way of doing things, medicating, whatever it is, that's going to work for everyone, I would say you are already wrong.
Right. I mean, so for example, I'm a big fan of traditional Chinese medicine in general, but guess what? There have been advancements, in the last few decades that aren't factored into TCM. Nothing against TCM, but if
Yes.
you're exactly right. If you have a rigid view, and if you're not getting better, it may be time to look outside that rigid view.
Absolutely. And before we hit record, we were talking about peptides and how, I've become this absolute believer and fan of peptides. And at the same time, peptides, just as so many things, are being misused, because just like anything, we were saying fasting, I mean, anything can be misused when you don't have the wisdom of knowing how to apply it in the right dose, in the right context, within the parameters of the right protocol, right? If we just run with something like, yay, peptides, you're going to run into problems.
Right,
And
or even it's like, hey, if this small dose of BPC 157 is good, let's just try a huge one. It must be better. And
yes,
actually, you can get a lot sicker if your immune system wakes up all of a sudden and releases all these toxins that you've diligently put away over the last few decades. Yes,
100%. Fantastic point. Yes. And in fact, there's a lot of sort of recent demonization around peptides, especially the weight loss peptides. And whenever there's a lot of demonizing about something, I kind of like, I go straight into the eye of the storm and I go, okay, I need to know, because there's always truth and there's always untruth in anything that gets demonized. There's something to it, and then there's also the complete opposite. And so ultimately, what I've learned with these weight loss peptides is that also point number one, we all make GLP-1 in our gut. So it's not like GLP-1 is something, super crazy toxic chemical. No, we make it. And how do we make it? We make it when we eat a high plant-based diet that is high in fiber and, essentially all the good things.
right.
So, that's also like, it's an interesting little fact. It's like, well, how can we make more GLP-1? We can make it by having a high plant-based diet, high in fiber. And at the same time, some people genetically don't make enough because there's genetic impairments. And we know in today's world, one of the probably the biggest problem in today's world is blood sugar dysregulation. So kind of like high levels of insulin sensitivity, resistance.
Right.
And many people living in, even though it's not clinically pre-diabetic, a lot of people are living sort of just under the traditional, terms of or conditions of pre-diabetes, and that alone creates, excuse my language, a shitstorm, a health storm,
Right.
shitstorm.
Increased inflammation and other problems, no question.
Everything, a long list. I mean, we know in perimenopause that is what happens, and so ultimately GLP-1s, the right ones, not the ones from the pharmaceutical industries, because they are always laden with preservatives. But when used correctly, with the right protocol, with the right preparation, etc., etc., they can be a godsend for a lot of people. But so it's one of those things, right? And of course there's other peptides, like you said, bpc 157. There's all the immune regulatory peptides. When people are just kind of using them willy-nilly because they heard it somewhere, someone talked about it, and then they go, well, let me just get the stuff on the internet, it can be a complete disaster and backfire.
Agreed. Yeah, it has the potential to heal. It also has the potential to destroy, and and you're exactly right. You have people out there just marketing and say it's the solution to everything. You've, to my mind, if you're going to use a peptide for regeneration, for example, exosomes are a collection of 500 different peptides. For example, you better be doing detoxification first, so that you can actually do regeneration with something like that.
Absolutely. And that is such a critical point. And, I think here again, a lot of people, they skip the basics because, like, oh, well, and I mean, I remember in the past doing that as well, right? I can't now name specifics, but I know I've done it where I kind of thought, oh, well, even like with an exercise program, right? I know in the past, I don't do it anymore, but where I used to just jump into like, okay, let's skip level 1 and level 2. Like, let's just go straight into level 3, right? Because then I'm going to
Right.
get all the results. Meanwhile, no, that's how you kill yourself. That's how you actually prevent yourself from having the results that you're looking for. And then the problem is that when people skip the fundamentals and they go right to whatever it is, even extensive fasting for that matter, right? They kind of go, oh, well, I'm just going to dive into a dry fast and, I don't do the preliminary work. And then it backfires, sometimes only months later or years later. And then they demonize the fasting, the peptide, the whatever it is, instead of understanding, no, actually, you simply didn't do it correctly.
Right, you didn't do it correctly, or there are other variables that are not necessarily knowable. For example, one of the things I see as a big problem is biofilm. Many people have biofilm, these layers
Yes.
of different infections and toxins, but when you start busting them up, you're going back in reverse chronological order, so that you're going back in time, so that you know for 1 month you might be dealing with the toxins of today, and then next month you're dealing with toxins from 5 years ago, and they're very different, and you're going to feel very different. And it's not because someone's doing something right or wrong, it's just the reality of it's complicated.
Absolutely. And that brings me to the point, often I ask myself, I mean, health didn't used to be this freaking complicated. It seems like in the last 30 years, 40 years, I mean, nowadays I look at certainly, sure. I mean, I think you and I probably also get particularly complicated cases,
True.
but I do find it takes a lot to really be totally healthy and thriving.
It does. And I mean, I think one reason for the complication is some of us know more than we did decades ago. That's number one. But number two, I think unfortunately there are levels of man-made toxins are just going up and up and up in our food supply, and plastics in the water and the air, forever chemicals, things like this. I think the levels we're exposed to today are much higher than they were 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Absolutely. Which then, I always find it funny when doctors say, "Oh, but detoxification is not necessary. The body should do it by itself."
Right.
And I go, "Yes, that's a fantastic, ideology that is in an ideal world." It works, right? Like if we wouldn't be having all the toxins and all the things that you just mentioned, then yes, our body should be able to deal with toxins naturally on its own. But since we do not live in an ideal world, that is simply not the reality. And I look at myself having done so many years of deep fasting, detox, etc. I still, at least really 3, 4 times a year, I go into a period of detoxification preventatively, right? Sometimes I kind of feel like, why am I doing it? I feel great. I could skip it, but I know better. And I go, well, prevention is better than curing.
Of course.
So let's talk about in a sense, I mean, again, I love the fact that you are so vastly knowledgeable. And, I can't stress it enough also for the listeners. When you choose your practitioner, especially once you have chronic health conditions that have been going on for 5 and more years, even 3 and more years, do yourself a favor, vet the people that you're working with, and you want to gain an understanding of how deep and vast is their knowledge, right? Because if they are very dogmatic and they just kind of like tell you about their one stream of understanding, there's a problem. So you want to choose someone, I would say the best advice for anyone: choose a person, a practitioner, a doctor that has vast knowledge. And that's just kind of like side note, for the listeners. To me, that's a must.
And
And
don't be afraid to get a second or third opinion before you make a
absolutely,
decision.
absolutely. And to ask a gazillion questions, to
Right.
really, even tricky questions, like ask people the tricky questions, because you want to come away with feeling this person is not dogmatic. This person has genuinely a vast knowledge and vast understanding of how the knowledge can and should be applied. Because the reality is, and here maybe just for a few minutes I want to talk about, because you are also deeply into mold and healing from mold illness. When I was, well, my whole family was faced with mold illness, but specifically our daughter, who had a life-threatening, it turned into a life-threatening condition called mucormycosis, which, funny enough, through COVID has become more prevalent in mold illness, right?
Right.
And of course, we can say, well, that's because the immune system has been affected, and because COVID has exposed us to things that simply we were not previously exposed to, and a lot of unknowns. So when we were faced with this, and literally our daughter is we went to this world-renowned hospital in Bangkok, and she is the first person that walked out of there with that condition alive.
Oh, wow.
And we didn't just do what the hospital, did.
Right.
Thank goodness the hospital is in Thailand. And so they kind of like closed, both eyes to the fact that we were giving her like 25 supplements, and we were giving her not the hospital diet, et cetera, et cetera. But as I was researching, I found this incredibly knowledgeable doctor in India who, when I first, it's Dr. Patel. He's part of our academy, and so he teaches in our academy. And the incredible knowledge that he has around mold illness, and specifically mucormycosis, just blew my mind. But now listen to this, and this is going to be interesting for the listeners as well. So there's three remedies that he uses for these, deadly ill patients that Western medicine just has absolutely no answer for. Camel milk is the
Hmm.
first one. So in fact, I have to say this. When I first spoke to Dr. Patel, he's in Surat, in a very kind of like not interesting part of India. And when he, in my first conversation, I was like, is this guy for real? Like, did I just, got conned? Or, I mean, like one just, stupidly thinks these things, right? Well, nothing could be further from the truth. He is truly a wealth of knowledge. And so camel milk, and initially I was like, oh, what do I do? Where do I get the camel milk? Well, actually, camel milk is very easily sourced. And the reason why camel milk is so powerful is because it is very high in immunoglobulins. So it
Exactly.
completely restores the immune system.
So it's immunotherapy, basically.
It is immunotherapy.
Yeah.
And I have been blown away at really, the relatively fast results that we got just from drinking camel milk. When mold protocols can be notoriously so complex and kind of endless. And I know plenty of people who've been ill with mold illness for 7, 8, 9, 10 years, and they're still not better.
True.
And then the other interesting ingredient or sort of recipe for healing is inhaling the smoke of neem leaves.
Hmm.
So burning neem leaves actually mixed with turmeric and inhaling that. I mean, this is particularly when there's particular issues in the sinuses. And that works for biofilms and for all kinds of things. So, these very simple things. And then, of course, really diet, and that is plant-based, a drying out diet. So I just kind of wanted to mention that because, again, and then did we only do that? No, we didn't. We did that, and we did peptides, and we did supplements, and, so we did all of the things. But ultimately, our whole family, and especially our daughter, like, we recovered at record speeds, right? I mean, that's the reality of what's possible when we apply the right protocols. So I want to talk about your expertise in Alzheimer's.
Sure.
Yeah, because that is also such a prevalent disease nowadays. And so tell us more about that.
Yeah, so unfortunately, Alzheimer's is expanding in numbers throughout the world. Over almost 7 million Americans. It's not just America; it's throughout the world now, especially with our Western lifestyle, Western diet,
Yeah,
and, and frankly, this is personal. I saw when my grandmother got Alzheimer's decades ago. It devastated not just her, but our whole family, my parents, and their whole generation were like, great, this is happening to my mom. Well, what's going to happen to me in 20 years or
of
so?
course.
So, so it's personal. And what's exciting is that we've been having amazing results reversing Alzheimer's. And when I talk to the general public, about a third of the people confront me and they say, Dr. Josh, we all know that Alzheimer's is not reversible. Therefore, you don't know what you're talking about. I say, no, no, no,
Yes,
no. I've been reversing Alzheimer's in my patients for 6, 7 years. I do know what I'm talking about. So the first step is just to get the information out there that this is actually reversible. But the key is you have to address all these different root causes because there may be between a dozen and 100 different root causes in different percentages in every single case. So it's not the case that there's just one magic thing that's going to fix everything. So we layer all the different lifestyle approaches, smart supplementation, medications, antibiotics if there's infection involved. And I'm also an investigator. There's a brand new FDA approved drug for compassionate use that decreases inflammation. So, so basically, we're doing all these different techniques, and we're seeing great results. And it's exciting. It's really exciting to give people their brain and their life back. Yeah.
yes, and this is a key to understand that, like you said, it's not that there's one root cause, but there's many root causes. Once we see such degree of degenerative disease, right? Similar to also mold illness, when there's mold illness, it's not just about killing the mold in the body. In some ways, that's the last thing that we
Right.
need to worry about.
Exactly right. And but some of the patients with Alzheimer's and dementia, they do have mold. And
Yes.
as you've experienced firsthand, there are two pieces to this. You have to go after the mold spore, the live mold, and then you also have to go after the fatty mold toxin, whether it's trichothecene, whatever the toxin is, and those treatments are separate, and you have to do both. Otherwise, you haven't eradicated. So, for example, in what you just shared with us, You may be burning, or breathing in neem and other things to get the mold in the sinuses. The problem is if you're not at the same time doing something, what I've, in my experience, those mold spores in the sinuses will just go straight back through the cribriform plate in the nose, back into the frontal lobe of the brain in the middle. And I would see this on PET scans with neuroquant imaging. I could actually image where this mold was going. So you can't just do one therapy. You have to coordinate it. And yeah, or you actually will make someone worse, right? So you can destroy the mold in their sinuses, but then now they've got mold in their brain, which you don't want.
Absolutely. And this is where, again, it comes down to the complexity of and the layeredness of treatment. I feel many people, and in some ways, like it's still like it boggles my mind. Like, how can we still, in this day and age, with all the information, how can we still believe that there is sort of like a pill, a quick cure for something, right? And here again, I feel the listeners, if you can walk away with the understanding that once you have chronic symptoms, it's because it's not that you have a disease, no matter what we've labeled those symptoms. It's because there is layers and layers of systemic degeneration and breakdown and weakening that has occurred, right? It's as simple as that. And I always tell people, you know, sometimes I get clients and they go, "Oh, I mean, it's rare, but every now and again
Okay.
I get a client that says, you know, the only problem that I have really is constipation." And I
Okay.
go, "Okay, how long has it been going on?" "Nah, maybe like, you know, whatever, 5, 10, 15 years." And I go, "Well, that is not a tiny problem. That is a major problem." So we have come to think, oh, constipation, you know, not a big deal. Well, once you are constipated, especially chronically, you have an inevitable recipe for further disasters that are just a matter of time coming your way, right?
That's been my experience too, Alex. And one of our protocols is to do colonics at least twice a week, just to get that whole system going again.
Absolutely. And that's just, you know, that's just a step number one, because also here with constipation, people think, don't you just have something for the constipation, you know, kind of like the
Right.
magic pill. Like, what's the
Right,
magic pill?
or the Western approach is, yeah, we'll just put antifreeze. We'll give you oral antifreeze. It works for your car. It'll work for your gut. Like, no, that's not the best way to do it.
Right. And so I like to, you know, make the example of, I had a client, I mean, yes, she had long standing health issues as well as chronic constipation. But ultimately, in order to resolve her chronic constipation fully, it took 5 years of, you know, I mean, she came off medication. There was a lot going on. It wasn't just constipation. But point being, it can take a long time. And of course, everyone's different in order to fully resolve our health issues. And I would say if we would all start paying more attention to every little tiny health niggle, right? Instead of going, oh, it's just a headache. Oh, it's just an occasional migraine. It's occasional constipation, whatever it is. We should start taking all the health niggles way more seriously, because the reality is, if they are ongoing, there's a systemic breakdown inevitably, right?
Right. Right. Each one of those has a message. You just need to decipher or find someone help you decipher what's really going on.
Yes, absolutely. So it's super exciting to hear about, you know, the work that you're doing with Alzheimer's. So tell us a little bit more. And
Sure.
I mean, I think already, once again, the listeners being able to walk away with the knowing that, hey, actually, Alzheimer's can be healed. Because I don't get a lot of people, you know, with these conditions, but sometimes I get, of course, you know, maybe one of my clients that says, "Oh, my dad is suffering, you know, can you help?" So, I mean, first of all, I'm always going to be referring them to you for sure. But also already where I've said to them, you can absolutely heal and regenerate. Sure, sometimes it may be too far gone, right? But there's so much that we can do, even just to improve someone's life.
Uh,
And
yeah.
so maybe if you want to say something more about sort of what you do and how you work, and even maybe how long does it take, right? For people to have a bit of a realistic expectation instead of just like, oh, 2, 3 weeks of this and that, or a couple months. It's like, no, it's more involved.
100%. So the first thing I would say is, to my mind, is we talk about Alzheimer's and dementia and people, who are elderly, over 55. But what I've noticed is there are many people younger than 55 who get brain fog.
Oh,
And I
yes.
know I know now that the root causes of that brain fog are often very similar to Alzheimer's for someone in their 60s or 70s. So it's more widespread than I'd ever thought. So that's number one. Number two, we're seeing improvement with this new FDA approved drug for compassionate use after just one dose. That's,
Wow.
to me, that's what's crazy. It's normally given intravenously once a month for 6 months,
Mm-hmm.
and it really depends how far advanced the Alzheimer's or dementia is. If the dementia is super advanced, it's going to take longer to get that full reversal. So that's number one. But we're not using just this FDA approved drug for compassionate use. We are also using uh, plasma exchange, total plasma exchange, in order to remove some of these inflammatory proteins and get rid of forever chemicals and other toxins.
Right.
So every case is a little bit different. There are some times where people you'll get better and then backtrack for a week and then get better again. So it's not a completely linear path, but to me the exciting thing is we're seeing improvement, within a month, and
That is
it's
phenomenal. That
yeah.
is phenomenal. And so, how, I mean, I know Alzheimer's and Parkinson are two very different things, but maybe because Parkinson is another sort of, it's also on the rise. We hear about it more and more. Maybe you can talk about like how is it different, and also would similar treatments work for Parkinson?
Yes, that's what's been interesting is that Parkinson's is known with a unique movement disorder affecting the neurotransmitter dopamine. But many cases of Parkinson's, you get dementia, problems with thinking with it. And we're finding our same protocols work because the root causes for many cases of Parkinson's are identical to Alzheimer's, whether
Yes.
we're talking about infections or certain toxins or insulin resistance. And that's the important thing about looking at root cause. Whereas, unfortunately, in the Western model, you talk about, oh, the diagnosis is Parkinson's. You don't have to go any deeper. It's just Parkinson's or it's Alzheimer's. You've got the label. Now you're done. Like, no, you're just getting started.
Absolutely. And that particular point actually drives me completely dilly because it really is just a label. It's a bit like now we have the label long COVID, right? Like, well,
Right.
what do we mean by long COVID? Long COVID means there is systemic stuff going on. And it's been going on, right? When people say, oh, but I was perfectly fine up until COVID. Well, you thought you were fine
Right.
because there was actually just something waiting to happen, and it happened to be COVID. It could have been something else. It could have been a tick bite, and then instead of calling it long COVID, you would have called it Lyme disease,
Right.
right? Or it could
Right.
have been mold, and then we would have called it mold disease. But actually, and this is to me another deeply crucial point that not just the general public needs to understand, but they do need to understand that all these labels in some ways are a little bit meaningless, right? I mean,
True.
they really
Yeah.
are.
Yeah. I mean, when you hear long COVID, what I think of is, oh, this patient was exposed to the spike protein, and now the spike protein is doing damage to their immune system, their brain, and what other tissues. But that's on top of a dozen other toxins and infections. It's like, it's COVID that finally started the dominoes going, but it's not the only thing, which is why, if you're looking for a pharmaceutical that that one magic bullet that's going to fix everything from long COVID, you're not going to find it because it's multifactorial.
Absolutely. And or for long COVID and many other things, right? There's now like the recipes like, oh, you have to go for hyperbaric oxygen treatment, and then there's ozone treatment, all these things that are hyped up as if they're the thing that are going to resolve the problem. It's like, well, yes, I mean, hyperbaric oxygen treatment can be great, right? I mean, in fact, I would say it's never going to damage you. It's only ever going to support anything that you're doing a little bit, like many other things. But is it going to be the thing that is actually going to resolve things? Not really.
It's going to be one piece of the solution, but that's our system. Things get hyped. If all you're doing is running a hyperbaric chamber, which I think that's a great thing to be running, you know you're going to be one piece of the solution, but normally you're not going to be able to fix everything just with diving in the chamber every day.
Right, right. Yeah, this is the so I was saying not only do listeners, do the lay people need to hear this, but really more and more doctors, practitioners need to understand that labels, diagnoses should only be, to me, they're reference points, right? So if someone comes to me and says, I have Hashimoto's, it's like, well, you don't have Hashimoto's. You are displaying the symptoms that we then call Hashimoto's. But actually, there's a whole other onslaught of things that are going on, right? And so it
100%.
goes with everything.
And sometimes I've seen, not only does you have Hashimoto's of the thyroid, you can also get it of the brain. So I mean, there are many sides to these disorders.
So maybe in closing, because of your vast knowledge, I would love to talk a little bit about also hormones, perimenopause, menopause, because there again, I really feel that sort of the new cash cows of pharma are women that are going through perimenopause and menopause, and they're
Right.
being bombarded with a lot of fear mongering, right? In fact, I actually had a doctor tell me these exact words. Um, oh, what is it saying? Joshua MD is not being recorded. Oh, but it's because it was fine up until now. We're good until now. We can cut this piece out, no problem. You tell me when things are. Let me see. Okay. It's. Yeah, I think it's fine. Um, so yeah, I think it would be great to talk a little bit about hormones and sort of women in perimenopause, menopause, because there is again such an avalanche of misinformation, fear mongering happening. And sort of my response, so as I was saying, the one doctor who actually said to me, Alex, if you don't, like, you're just in time now to go on hormones. If you don't do it, mark my words, when you're going to sit there at 70 with Alzheimer's in your nappies, you're going to wish you would have taken hormones. And I was like, wow, okay, so that's just, a recipe for everyone. Like, no matter their background, no matter their lifestyle, hormones for everyone. Let's go have a hormone party. Right. Yeah, and that's really my point. I'm not opposed. I fully agree. Some women will need it for various reasons, but then there's also a lot of women who maybe have also better genetics, have been doing a lot of work already, and have lived for a long time a very healthy lifestyle, and therefore they're going to get away very, very well without taking hormones, because ultimately we also have to see that the process of aging is a natural one. And because another argument that a lot of doctors use is, well, women are supposed to not live long past fertility. And there also I go like, where is that reflected? Right? I mean, we all know that women tend to live longer than men, so that's kind of point number one. So we don't just all die at 55, right? uh, and neither have we in the past. I mean, like, old age women have been around for a very long time. So this argument, but I see it used a lot. And I always wonder, like, is no one picking up on it and going, hang on, doctor, this is not right. This is just, complete, like, weird. But it's been coming up a lot. A lot of people are throwing it around. Yeah. And so maybe, these last few minutes, because like I said, it's rare that I get to actually speak to someone with whom I can have an open conversation, and especially when they're a doctor, it's like, forget it. Then you cannot have an open conversation. So I'm loving this conversation with you, Dr. Josh. So let's talk for a moment about hormones. Um, you know, because this is another argument where I think a lot of people who are deeply married to sort of the natural lifestyle, a lot of people who come maybe from raw food lifestyle, or even, veganism, plant based, they're deeply rooted in this naturalism and puritanism. And therefore, I will never even consider hormones. And I would say that was even myself. I am not on hormones currently, but I have definitely opened up to the idea to again say, well, never say never. And I don't yet know. I don't know enough. And, for now, I don't need them. But I would love to hear, yes, your take, and how can we have sort of really like a conversation, a wise conversation about it? Absolutely. Absolutely. And I can tell you from personal experience, when I started experiencing symptoms of perimenopause 3 years ago, which initially I was like, what even is going on? Because I was sure that by living so healthily and on such a high raw food diet, etc., that I would not experience anything. And so when I did, I started, I figured, well, I'm not a hormone expert. I'm going to seek out, literally the experts out there. And I had several consults. One of the doctors that I consulted with is a world expert or considered a world expert. And again, I was absolutely shocked by the complete disinterest in my history, in my actual story. And his recipe, literally within minutes, was a long list of all the hormones that I should be on for the rest of my life. And I left the call and I'm thinking it took me months to get this call and to have, like, it just didn't make any sense. And ultimately, I then found the Russian health model, which, or a part of the Russian health model, those, the ones that have developed the peptide bioregulators. And their first port of call is, let's work on the hypothalamus, right? Like, what a wild and novel idea. The hypothalamus is the master gland and obviously trickles down to the pituitary gland. So when there's hormonal issues, well, maybe we should start working upstream instead of, fixing things down there. Yeah. So, these are, I feel maybe we can do even another call, even though you're, strictly speaking, not a hormone expert. I actually feel that you have wisdom and knowledge to share, especially for all us women that are going through perimenopause and that will be going into menopause at some point in the very near future, to really have a voice of wisdom. Right, right. Yeah. But that, so what you're saying is, the answer is not just, oh, let's just fix your hormones or, top up your hormones, but rather we need to once again look at the full picture. And and I would even add, now that I've been getting deeply into genomics, I before I give someone hormones, I would want to see genetically what are the hormones, the receptors doing in their body. Because if I'm giving someone hormones that already is struggling with excess estrogen and, a whole bunch of other genetic impairments, again, I may make things worse. So it's not a recipe, for success kind of right away. Yes. Yes. So in other words, nothing in today's health system is really simple. It is complex, but when we have the right people that we're working with and people that have the wisdom and open-mindedness, right, to also maybe some point say, well, if this isn't working, we need to go into a different direction, instead of like, no, we're going to stay carnivore, or we're going to stay, whatever the recipe was, we need to stay open. Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, Dr. Josh, and I definitely will want to have another conversation with you, because I just deeply appreciate your openness and your wisdom. And I thank you. Yeah, it was great. Thank you.